Meanwhile, the New York Times characterized Trump's current behavior and state of mind this way. Mr. Trump has been both invigorated and angered by the prospect of being arrested, according to those who have spoken with him. And he has also entertained a certain amount of magical thinking. Joining us now is the lead author on that story, Michael Bender, political correspondent for the New York Times, along with the great Matthew Dowd, chief strategist for the Bush-Cheney 2004 presidential campaign and an MSNBC political analyst. Gentlemen, thank you for joining me. And I'll start with you, Michael, about the magical thinking. If you could illustrate to us or just retell, what kind of magical thinking are we talking about in Trump world as it pertains to this indictment?
Yeah, there's a couple things here. One is we've talked to several people who have spoken to the former president who say he's become fixated on an idea of a perp walk. This is the tradition that detectives and police reporters in New York City are very familiar with, of the newly arrested being walked past a gaggle of reporters and news cameras. And Trump has been kind of captivated by this idea, talking to people about, if he's going to have a perp walk and whether he would smile for the cameras, how that kind of thing might, play with the American public. Has left several people thinking that that he sees this as as kind of a fun thing to do, and certainly an opportunity here to make a political statement. What he's sort of thinking here is that anything to project strength and confidence. He doesn't want to be seen as slinking away in shame if he's arrested. But the truth is, he probably most likely will not have a perp walk. That sort of thing will be, if he is arrested, that sort of thing will be negotiated by law enforcement and Secret Service, who will most likely want to avoid a massive scene. And the other kind of wild thing here is that he's been launched a very big pressure campaign. You showed some of those really over-the-top campaign requests and contribution requests. He's gone on a tirade attacking the Manhattan DA, and some Trump aides have convinced themselves and have spoken to the former president about this, that pressure campaign may actually be having an effect, and that the Manhattan DA may walk away from an indictment, may decide not to indict the former president because of the pressure campaign Trump is weighing. We've seen this before. The Trump White House had convinced themselves that a Democratic House run by Nancy Pelosi might not indict him, that they thought at the time that they had turned some Democratic votes and that vote would go down. We know that didn't happen the first time or the second time. It's unlikely that his pressure campaign is having any effect on the Manhattan District Attorney's Office now either.
Yeah, my head is spinning with all the things you just said, Michael. I mean, I know Trump is embracing certain aspects of this potential indictment, but your reporting indicates that there is actual fear in Trump land. And I wonder if you could take us back to the fear that he felt, I think it was in 1973, about being arrested after the first criminal investigation into the DOJ's investigation into the Trump and their potential suit for housing discrimination.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, there a couple things are true here. One is Trump is trying to move this legal fight in Manhattan onto a political battlefield, so that he can find a way to leverage this for his campaign moving forward and to mitigate as much damage as possible. But let's not kid ourselves here. Donald Trump does not want to be arrested. He does not want to be indicted. We see that in social media. You see some of his posts on his social media website, all capital letters to the Manhattan DA, do the right thing. He does not want an indictment on his record. And he's always had a certain fear of being arrested. I mean, it sort of sounds silly to say that out loud, but it's true. I mean, he has he's cultivated a lot of relationships with that dynamic underpinning it. He folks who may be able to help him if he got to the point of an arrest or an indictment. He made sure to keep them close. I would like to just jump back. You were asking about the fundraising. I do think that from what I've seen in some polling lately, I mean, Trump's base doesn't seem to be going anywhere. But what the biggest question I think Republican voters are going to face in this Republican primary is whether they think Trump can win in November of 2024, if they think he can beat Biden, he's got to bring back moderate Republicans and independents who have abandoned him for 3 consecutive election cycles at this point. We've seen him steady his polling in the last few months, but that's because, in large part, he's been playing to smaller crowds. He's been answering questions. He's doing more traditional type of campaigning, not fully, not 100% of the time, but more than he used to. His response to this indictment is exactly the kind of thing that has long turned off moderate Republicans and independents from Trump, and I think that's the thing to watch. The effect that this could have moving forward.
All right. I just want to say, for the record, I don't know a lot of people that have an ongoing and generalized fear about being arrested. So that's interesting psychology right there. We're going to leave it there.
Fair.